Sit down, genius, because everything your overpaid history teacher shoved down your throat was a straight-up lie. Paul Revere never yelled, "The British are coming." Washington's teeth weren't wood. They were ripped out of enslaved people's mouths. And Edison didn't invent the light bulb. You sat in class for 12 years eating up fairy tales like a good little sheep, and nobody had the guts to tell you the truth. So if you're tired of being the most confidently wrong person at the dinner table, smash that like button, subscribe right now, and stick around. Because these 111 lies are about to ruin everything you thought you knew. 1. Paul Revere never actually shouted, "The British are coming" during his famous midnight ride in 1775, and the reason is honestly hilarious when you stop and think about it. See, the colonists at that time still considered themselves British citizens, so screaming "The British are coming" would have basically been like screaming "We are coming," which makes zero sense. Revere quietly whispered warnings about the regulars approaching, going door to door, like a sneaky neighborhood gossip. The dramatic shouting version came from a Longfellow poem written almost 100 years later. Henry just needed something catchy that rhymed, and accidentally created the most misquoted moment in American history forever. 2. The Declaration of Independence was absolutely not signed on July 4th, 1776, even though every American fires up a grill that day believing otherwise. On July 4th, the Continental Congress only approved the text, basically giving it a thumbs up like a group chat reacting to a long message. The actual signing party happened on August 2nd, when most of the Founding Fathers finally showed up with their fancy quill pens and dramatic signatures. John Hancock made his name huge because he wanted King George to read it without glasses, allegedly. So every 4th of July, Americans are technically celebrating the wrong date with hot dogs and fireworks. 3. George Washington had famously terrible teeth, but the wooden denture story is complete fiction that somehow survived centuries of American classrooms. His actual dentures were a horrifying mashup of hippopotamus ivory, gold wire, brass screws, and yes, human teeth pulled from enslaved people on his Mount Vernon plantation. Records even show Washington personally paid enslaved individuals for some of those teeth, though the transaction itself remains deeply disturbing by any modern standard. Imagine the first president of the United States chewing his dinner with someone else's molars hammered into hippo bone. The wooden teeth myth probably stuck around because it sounded charmingly rustic instead of revealing something genuinely uncomfortable about American history. 4. The Pilgrims never actually landed on Plymouth Rock, and the whole rock thing is honestly one of the most ridiculous historical mix-ups ever sold to school children. There is literally zero mention of any rock in any Pilgrim writings from 1620, which is wild considering these guys documented basically everything else, including the weather and their stomach problems. The famous rock was first identified in 1741 by a 94-year-old man named Thomas Faunce, who claimed his father told him it was the landing spot. That was 121 years after the fact. Americans basically built a national legend around one elderly guy pointing vaguely at a rock he liked. 5. The Emancipation Proclamation sounds like Abraham Lincoln dropped the mic and ended slavery in one heroic moment. But the reality is way more complicated and weirdly sneaky. When Lincoln signed it on January 1st, 1863, the document only freed enslaved people in Confederate states that the Union government did not actually control at the time. So Lincoln basically freed people in territory he could not reach, while slavery remained perfectly legal in border states like Kentucky and Maryland that stayed loyal. It was a brilliant wartime move designed to weaken the South, not a universal liberation. Actual nationwide abolition required the 13th Amendment passed nearly 3 years later. 6. The Betsy Ross flag origin story is basically American folklore built on one guy bragging about his grandma almost a century after the fact. The entire legend came from her grandson William Canby, who stood up at a Pennsylvania Historical Society meeting in 1870 and confidently claimed Betsy personally sewed the first American flag for George Washington. That was 94 years after the supposed event, with no documents, no letters, no receipts, and absolutely no proof whatsoever. Betsy Ross was indeed a real Philadelphia upholsterer who sewed flags, but linking her to the original Stars and Stripes is essentially a family rumor that accidentally became national gospel. 7. The Salem witch trials are remembered for terrifying images of women burning at the stake, except absolutely none of that ever actually happened in Massachusetts in 1692. 19 accused witches were hanged at Gallows Hill. One elderly farmer named Giles Corey was slowly crushed to death under heavy stones for refusing to enter a plea, and several others died waiting in horrible jail conditions. The burning thing comes from European witch trials, not American ones. Hollywood basically borrowed the dramatic flames from medieval France and slapped them onto Puritan Massachusetts. The real story is grim enough without the fire, featuring teenage girls, jealous neighbors, and bad rye bread, possibly causing hallucinations. 8. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb, and pretending he did is honestly disrespectful to at least 22 earlier inventors who had working versions before him. British scientist Humphrey Davy demonstrated electric light back in 1802, and Joseph Swan in England actually had a functioning bulb before Edison even started seriously experimenting. What Edison really invented was a longer-lasting commercial bulb plus an entire electrical distribution system, which is genuinely impressive but very different from inventing the concept itself. His real superpower was marketing and patents, basically being the Steve Jobs of his era. The myth survives because America loves a single heroic genius story. 9. Tombstone, Arizona, the wildest of all Wild West towns, actually banned carrying firearms inside city limits back in 1881, which is stricter than most American cities today. Cowboys riding into town had to hand over their pistols and rifles at the sheriff's office or designated stables before doing anything else, like checking weapons at a coat room. The famous gunfight at the OK Corral literally happened because the Earp brothers were trying to enforce that exact gun ordinance against the Clanton and McClory Cowboys. Hollywood somehow rebranded the Old West as a lawless shooting gallery, but real frontier towns were often more regulated than expected. 10. The classic American cowboy in every Western movie is almost always a tall white guy in a hat, but the real cowboy demographics would absolutely shock most Hollywood casting directors. Historians estimate roughly 1 in 4 cowboys working the cattle trails after the Civil War was black, with many being formerly enslaved men who headed west seeking actual freedom and paying work. A huge number were also Mexican vaqueros, who basically invented the entire cowboy profession, including the lasso, saddle, and rodeo traditions. The whitewashed cowboy image came almost entirely from dime novels and 20th century films, erasing everyone else from a remarkably diverse workforce. 11. The Boston Tea Party gets remembered as angry colonists rebelling against expensive British tea, but the actual economics were the complete opposite of what most Americans assume. The Tea Act of 1773 actually made British tea cheaper for colonists by giving the East India Company a monopoly and cutting out middlemen merchants. So the famous 1773 harbor protest was never about high prices at all. It was about the principle of taxation without representation in Parliament, plus a bunch of colonial smugglers like John Hancock who suddenly could not compete with discount legal tea. Angry colonists dressed as Mohawk warriors dumped 342 chests overboard and accidentally created the most misunderstood protest in history. 12. The Pocahontas. Love story Disney told millions of kids is basically Hollywood inventing romance, where absolutely none existed in reality. When Pocahontas met John Smith in 1607 Virginia, she was approximately 10 years old, and Smith was a 27-year-old English soldier, which makes the romantic angle deeply uncomfortable to consider. Her real name was actually Amanute, with Pocahontas being a childhood nickname meaning playful one. The famous head-saving scene Smith described decades later was likely either a misunderstood Powhatan adoption ceremony or just straight-up fabricated for book sales. She was later kidnapped, forced to convert, renamed Rebecca, and married to tobacco farmer John Rolfe. 13. A genuinely shocking number of Americans somehow believe Benjamin Franklin was once President of the United States, when he actually never held that office a single day in his entire life. Franklin was many incredible things, including a printer, scientist, postmaster, ambassador to France, and one of the most famous founding fathers in colonial history. He signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, charmed the entire French court, and basically invented modern American diplomacy. But by the time George Washington became the first president in 1789, Franklin was 83 years old and dying. He passed away just 1 year later, never having lived in any presidential residence. 14. Every old Western movie shows wagon trains forming defensive circles to fight off attacking Native Americans. But that dramatic scene was almost entirely a Hollywood invention. Settlers actually circled their wagons at night for one extremely boring practical reason, which was creating a temporary corral to keep their livestock from wandering off into the prairie. Cattle, horses, and oxen had a strong tendency to disappear overnight, and replacing them on the trail was nearly impossible. Real attacks on wagon trains were also extremely rare overall. Most pioneers actually traded peacefully with native tribes for food, directions, and supplies, which makes the whole circling drama feel especially silly in retrospect. 15. Eli Whitney, inventing the cotton gin in 1793, gets taught as a brilliant labor-saving device, but the actual historical impact was the exact opposite of reducing slavery. Before the gin, separating sticky green seeds from cotton fibers was so painfully slow that cotton was barely profitable as a crop. Whitney's machine processed cotton roughly 50 times faster, suddenly making plantations enormously lucrative across the entire American South. So instead of freeing enslaved workers from tedious labor, planters dramatically expanded cotton fields and bought more enslaved people to plant, pick, and process the massive new harvests. The enslaved population in America exploded from around 700,000 to nearly 4 million. 16. Christopher Columbus discovering America in 1492 is one of the most stubbornly incorrect facts ever taught, considering Viking sailors beat him there by roughly 500 entire years. Norse explorer Leif Erikson sailed from Greenland around 1000 AD and established a settlement called Vinland in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Archaeologists confirmed this in the 1960s by digging up actual Viking buildings at L'Anse aux Meadows. Indigenous peoples obviously arrived thousands of years before that, having already built entire civilizations across 2 continents. Columbus, meanwhile, died in 1506 still genuinely convinced he had landed somewhere in Asia near India, which is why he called locals Indians. 17. The northern colonies love getting credit for moral superiority over the slaveholding South. But every single one of the 13 original American colonies legally practiced slavery without exception. Massachusetts became the first colony to officially legalize slavery way back in 1641, and New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey all had thriving enslaved populations for over a century. Wealthy northern merchants got rich from the Atlantic slave trade itself, shipping captives, sugar, and rum across the ocean. Northern states gradually abolished slavery between 1780 and the early 1800s. But pretending the North was always pure is a comforting myth, not actual American history. 18. The Liberty Bell sounds like it was named by patriotic Revolutionary War heroes celebrating independence from Britain. But the real story is significantly more recent and slightly anticlimactic. The bell was originally just called the State House Bell, hanging in Pennsylvania's Independence Hall and ringing for various civic events without any particular fame. It got its famous Liberty Bell nickname from 1830s abolitionists who adopted it as a symbol for ending slavery, inspired by the biblical inscription about proclaiming liberty throughout the land. Even the famous giant crack happened decades after the Revolution, possibly while ringing for either George Washington's birthday or a Chief Justice's funeral. 19. The popular image of founding fathers as devout Christians establishing a Christian nation is genuinely complicated by the fact that several leading founders openly rejected Christian doctrine. Thomas Jefferson literally cut up a Bible with scissors, removing every miracle and supernatural reference, creating what became known as the Jefferson Bible. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine were deists who believed in a distant creator God but dismissed organized religion as superstition. John Adams once wrote that this would be the best world if there were no religion in it. They deliberately wrote a constitution mentioning no God whatsoever, which absolutely was not an accident or oversight by these guys. 20. George Armstrong Custer charging heroically into impossible odds at Little Bighorn is American mythology at its most flattering, but the reality is closer to a stunning act of military arrogance. In June 1876, Custer attacked a massive peaceful encampment of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho families along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. He was specifically warned by scouts that the camp was enormous, possibly the largest gathering of Plains tribes ever assembled in one place. Custer ignored the warnings, split his already small 7th Cavalry into 3 groups, and attacked anyway. Warriors led by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull wiped out his battalion within roughly an hour. 21. The Oregon Trail looms in American imagination as a deadly gauntlet of Native American attacks, but the actual killer was something far less dramatic and significantly grosser. Roughly 1 in 10 travelers died on the 2,000-mile journey west between 1840 and 1860, with historians estimating around 20,000 graves scattered along the route. The overwhelming cause of death was cholera, dysentery, and other diseases spread through contaminated drinking water at crowded campsites. Accidents from wagons, drownings at river crossings, and accidental gunshots killed many more pioneers than any conflict. Native American attacks accounted for only about 4% of total deaths, which completely contradicts every dramatic movie scene ever filmed. 22. Alexander Graham Bell getting credit for inventing the telephone is one of the most contested patent stories in American history, considering Italian immigrant Antonio Meucci had a working version years earlier. Meucci developed his teletrafono in the 1850s, even building a prototype that connected his basement workshop to his sick wife's bedroom upstairs. He filed a patent caveat in 1871, but could not afford the renewal fee, which expired right before Bell filed his famous 1876 patent. Some historians suspect Bell's lawyers got access to Meucci's documents at the same patent office. Congress officially acknowledged Meucci's contribution in 2002, roughly 113 years too late. 23. Thanksgiving has been celebrated in some form since 1621, but the modern annual federal holiday actually started during one of America's darkest moments rather than as a pilgrim tradition. President Abraham Lincoln declared the official national Thanksgiving holiday in October 1863, smack in the middle of the brutal Civil War. The country was deeply divided, casualties were mounting after Gettysburg, and Lincoln desperately needed something to unite a fractured Union and boost morale. Magazine editor Sarah Josepha Hale had been writing letters to presidents for 17 years begging for exactly this holiday. Lincoln finally agreed, hoping a shared day of gratitude might remind Americans what they still had in common. 24. The Underground Railroad sounds incredibly cool when you are a child learning about it, mostly because most kids genuinely picture actual underground trains rumbling through secret tunnels. The reality involved 0 trains, 0 tracks, and absolutely no tunnels of any kind. It was actually a vast informal network of safe houses, churches, barns, and trusted individuals helping enslaved people escape northward to free states or Canada. The railroad terminology was just symbolic code language used by participants, with conductors guiding passengers between stations. Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor, personally made roughly 13 dangerous trips back into slave states and helped guide approximately 70 people to freedom. 25. The American government conducting unethical experiments on its own citizens sounds like paranoid conspiracy theory material, except it absolutely happened on a massive scale well into the 1970s. The Atomic Energy Commission deliberately injected hospital patients with plutonium without telling them, just to study how the human body absorbed radiation. The Army released radioactive particles over St. Louis neighborhoods to test dispersal patterns. Pregnant women in Tennessee were given radioactive iron supplements while doctors monitored their babies. Prisoners had their testicles irradiated in Oregon and Washington state experiments. President Bill Clinton finally issued a formal apology in 1995 after a federal advisory committee uncovered the disturbing scope of these programs. 26. The classic Thanksgiving turkey is so deeply tied to the holiday that most Americans assume the Pilgrims were carving giant birds in 1621, when the actual menu was wildly different. Surviving accounts from Plymouth colonist Edward Winslow describe the 3-day harvest feast featuring mostly venison brought by 90 visiting Wampanoag warriors, plus various seafood like mussels, lobster, eel, and cod from nearby waters. Wildfowl was mentioned, but probably included ducks, geese, and swans, rather than turkey specifically. There were no potatoes, no cranberry sauce, no pumpkin pie, and definitely no green bean casserole. The modern turkey-centric meal mostly developed during the Victorian era. 27. The Confederate battle flag waving today at rallies, trucks, and various controversial gatherings was never actually the official national flag of the Confederacy. The real Confederate States of America had 3 different national flags during the Civil War, including one called the Stars and Bars that looked confusingly similar to the Union flag. The instantly recognizable red flag with the blue X pattern was specifically the battle flag of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. After the war ended in 1865, the battle flag basically disappeared from public view for decades. It only got revived massively during the 1950s and 1960s as a symbol against civil rights movements. 28. The shot heard around the world fired at Lexington on April 19th. 1775 officially started the American Revolution, except absolutely nobody actually knows which side pulled the trigger first. Roughly 70 nervous colonial militiamen lined up on Lexington Green facing several hundred British regulars marching toward Concord to seize colonial weapons. Captain John Parker reportedly told his men not to fire unless fired upon. Then somebody, somewhere, fired a single mystery shot, and chaos immediately exploded across the field. 8 colonists died within minutes. Both sides spent decades afterward blaming each other through testimonies, letters, and accusations. The identity of that one trigger-happy person remains a permanent historical mystery. 29. The Battle of New Orleans is celebrated as Andrew Jackson's greatest military triumph and a glorious American victory over the British Empire, except the entire fight technically should not have happened at all. American and British diplomats had already signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24, 1814, officially ending the War of 1812 weeks earlier. Unfortunately for roughly 2,000 British casualties, news traveled by sailing ship across the Atlantic Ocean back then, and word of the peace treaty had not yet reached Louisiana. So Jackson's forces fought a completely unnecessary battle on January 8, 1815, while peace had already been declared somewhere across the ocean. 30. Andrew Jackson, before becoming the 7th president, was basically the most violent founding-era figure imaginable, fighting an absurd number of duels for completely petty reasons throughout his life. In 1806, Jackson killed lawyer Charles Dickinson in a Kentucky duel triggered by an unpaid horse racing bet, plus Dickinson allegedly insulting Jackson's wife Rachel. Dickinson was reportedly one of the best pistol shots in America and fired first, hitting Jackson in the chest near his heart. Jackson somehow stayed standing, took careful aim, and shot Dickinson dead. He carried that bullet inside his body for the rest of his life because surgeons could not safely remove it. 31. Manifest destiny sounds like an ancient guiding principle the Founding Fathers carved into the Liberty Bell, but the actual phrase did not even exist until decades after the country was founded. Newspaper editor John O'Sullivan first coined the term in an 1845 magazine article promoting the annexation of Texas, arguing that America had a divine mission to expand across the entire North American continent. That was 69 full years after the Declaration of Independence. So when textbooks suggest the founders dreamed of westward expansion under manifest destiny, they are accidentally giving credit to a phrase invented by a random journalist trying to sell magazines and stir up patriotic excitement. 32. In God We Trust feels like one of those phrases stamped onto American money since George Washington's era. But the truth is it only appeared on paper currency starting in 1957. The motto first showed up on coins during the Civil War in 1864, partly because religious leaders pushed for it during a deeply uncertain national moment. Paper bills, however, stayed completely secular for almost another century. President Dwight Eisenhower signed the law, adding it to paper money during the Cold War, when American leaders wanted to clearly distinguish the country from godless communist Soviet Russia. So the phrase is essentially a relatively modern political statement disguised as ancient tradition. 33. The deeply uncomfortable fact that some free Black Americans owned enslaved people in the antebellum South genuinely surprises most history students hearing it for the first time. Census records confirm that a small but real number of free black slaveholders existed across states like Louisiana, South Carolina, and Virginia before the Civil War. The motivations were complicated and varied dramatically. Some bought enslaved family members, specifically because state laws made manumitting them nearly impossible, essentially keeping loved ones legally enslaved on paper for protection. Others, however, ran plantations exactly like white slaveholders did, exploiting enslaved workers for profit. American history is significantly messier than the clean narratives schools usually deliver. 34. The Tuskegee syphilis study sounds like something out of dystopian fiction, but the United States Public Health Service genuinely ran this horrifying experiment on real Americans from 1932 all the way until 1972. Around 600 poor black men in rural Alabama were enrolled, told they were receiving free government health care for bad blood. In reality, doctors deliberately left 399 syphilis-infected men completely untreated for 40 entire years, watching the disease destroy their bodies. Even after penicillin became the standard cure by 1947, researchers withheld it on purpose. The study only ended in 1972 when a whistleblower leaked the details to the Associated Press, sparking massive national outrage. 35. Davy Crockett dying heroically swinging his musket. Old Betsy at Mexican soldiers during the Alamo is one of America's most cherished frontier legends, but Mexican accounts tell a very different ending. Multiple Mexican officers, including Lieutenant Colonel José Enrique de la Peña, wrote that Crockett actually surrendered along with a handful of other defenders after the battle was essentially over on March 6, 1836. General Santa Anna then ordered the prisoners executed on the spot, despite his officers asking for mercy. American writers, of course, found the surrender version completely unacceptable, so the heroic last stand version became the official story. Texas schools have repeated it ever since. 36. The Statue of Liberty standing in New York Harbor as the ultimate symbol of American freedom was originally designed for a completely different country thousands of miles away. French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi initially proposed a massive statue called Egypt Bringing Light to Asia, intended to stand at the entrance of the newly completed Suez Canal in Egypt around 1869. The Egyptian government basically said no thanks, mostly because they could not afford the enormous cost of building it. Bartholdi then recycled the design concept, swapped the Egyptian peasant woman for a robed Roman goddess Libertas, and successfully pitched it as a French gift to America instead. 37. Memorial Day gets remembered as a quiet federal holiday, established by white veterans groups after the Civil War. But the actual first organized Memorial Day was held by formerly enslaved black residents of Charleston, South Carolina. On May 1, 1865, just weeks after the Confederacy collapsed, roughly 10,000 freedmen gathered at a former Confederate prison camp, where hundreds of Union soldiers had died in horrible conditions. They properly reburied 257 Union prisoners, built a fence around the new cemetery, and held a massive celebration featuring school children, ministers, and brass bands. Historian David Blight rediscovered this remarkable event in 1996, after it had been deliberately erased from local memory. 38. The iconic Hollywood sign perched on Mount Lee in Los Angeles is one of the most photographed landmarks on Earth, but its original purpose was not glamour, fame, or movie magic whatsoever. Real estate developer Harry Chandler ordered the giant sign built in 1923 to advertise a new housing subdivision called Hollywoodland, with the spelling literally including those last four letters. Each enormous letter stood 45 feet tall and originally had 4,000 light bulbs flashing at night to attract attention. The sign was supposed to last only about 18 months as temporary marketing, then come down after lots sold. The land letters were finally removed in 1949. 39. Project MKUltra sounds like a fictional spy thriller designed to scare conspiracy theorists, but it was an entirely real CIA program running from roughly 1953 through the late 1960s. Agency scientists wanted to develop mind control techniques during the Cold War, so they began secretly dosing unsuspecting American and Canadian citizens with LSD, mescaline, and various other powerful drugs. Targets included prisoners, mental hospital patients, prostitutes' clients in San Francisco safe houses, and even fellow CIA employees during meetings. One agent named Frank Olson allegedly jumped from a hotel window after being dosed without consent in 1953. CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most program documents destroyed in 1973. 40. Sacagawea gets pictured in most history textbooks as a grown adult woman confidently guiding Lewis and Clark across the wilderness. But the actual person was incredibly young throughout the entire 1804 to 1806 expedition. She was roughly 16 years old when she joined the Corps of Discovery, having been kidnapped by another tribe at around 12 and later sold to French-Canadian trapper Toussaint Charbonneau as one of his wives. She also carried her infant son Jean-Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp, on her back during essentially the entire 8,000-mile journey. William Clark grew fond of the baby and later helped raise him as an adopted son. 41. The Pilgrims arriving on the Mayflower in 1620 get celebrated as brave free settlers seeking religious freedom, but a huge percentage of early American colonists actually arrived as indentured servants bound by harsh contracts. Historians estimate roughly half to two-thirds of European immigrants to the American colonies between 1630 and 1776 came under indenture agreements. They signed contracts trading 4 to 7 years of basically unpaid labor in exchange for ship passage across the Atlantic Ocean. Conditions were brutal, with masters legally allowed to beat servants, extend contracts for minor infractions, and sell remaining time to other owners. Many died from disease or overwork before ever earning freedom. 42. The Pony Express gallops through American imagination as a long-lasting Wild West institution, but the entire operation existed for only about 18 months before collapsing into bankruptcy. The mail service launched in April 1860, using young riders galloping between roughly 184 stations stretched across 1,900 miles from Missouri to California. Riders changed horses every 10 miles and rotated every 75 miles or so. The whole thing was genuinely impressive, delivering mail in about 10 days instead of weeks. Then the transcontinental telegraph was completed in October 1861, instantly making the Pony Express obsolete. The company shut down 2 days later, losing nearly $200,000 in modern equivalent. 43. George Washington being celebrated as the first American president is technically true under the current Constitution, but 8 other men actually held the title president before him under the earlier Articles of Confederation. These guys served as president of the Continental Congress between 1781 and 1788, including John Hanson, Elias Boudinot, Thomas Mifflin, Richard Henry Lee, and others. The role was very limited, mostly involving ceremonial duties and signing official documents during one-year terms. John Hanson particularly liked claiming to be the first president of the United States, which is technically defensible by certain interpretations. Most Americans have never even heard these 8 names in any history class. 44. Patrick Henry shouting, "Give me liberty or give me death." At the 1775 Virginia Convention is one of the most quoted lines in American Revolutionary history, except no contemporary written record of him saying it actually exists. The famous speech was reconstructed from memory by biographer William Wirt in 1817, roughly 42 years after Henry supposedly delivered it. Wirt collected various second-hand accounts from elderly people who claimed to remember being present that day. The dramatic phrasing and theatrical structure were almost certainly polished up significantly during writing. Henry definitely gave a fiery speech in Richmond that March, but those exact iconic words probably came from Wirt's pen. 45. The United States dropping bombs during World War II conjures images of European and Pacific battlefields, but the most heavily bombed country in history is actually Laos. Between 1964 and 1973, American planes dropped over 2 million tons of ordnance on this small Southeast Asian nation during what became known as the Secret War. That single bombing campaign exceeded the total tonnage dropped on Germany and Japan, combined during all of World War II. Around 270 million cluster bomblets fell on Laos, with roughly 80 million failing to detonate immediately. Those leftover bombs continue killing and maiming Laotian farmers, children, and rural villagers all the way through today. 46. The White House and the United States Capitol building stand as proud symbols of American democracy and freedom. But both iconic structures were partially built by enslaved laborers between 1792 and 1815. Records confirm that hundreds of enslaved men were rented from local Maryland and Virginia slaveholders by the federal government, earning their owners about $60 per year per worker. These laborers quarried stone in Aquia Creek, hauled massive sandstone blocks, sawed timber, fired bricks, and performed essentially every backbreaking task involved in construction. Free black workers, Irish immigrants, and others also contributed labor. Congress only officially acknowledged this uncomfortable history in 2012 with a small plaque inside the Capitol Visitor Center. 47. The first car crash in American history happened in 1891 in Ohio City, Ohio, which sounds extremely embarrassing once you realize the surrounding context. Inventor James Lambert was driving his single-cylinder gasoline buggy down a dirt road when he hit a tree root, lost control, and crashed straight into a hitching post. The accident caused minor injuries to him and his passenger, plus some damage to the buggy itself. The hilarious part is that there were only a handful of automobiles existing anywhere in the entire state at that time. Lambert essentially managed to crash one of the few cars in Ohio into a stationary wooden post. 48. Mr. Rogers' gently teaching kindness on public television feels timeless, but most viewers had absolutely no idea Fred Rogers was officially an ordained Presbyterian minister with serious theological training. He graduated from Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in 1962, with his specific ministry assignment being to serve children through mass media rather than leading a traditional congregation. Rogers genuinely believed television could be a sacred space, helping children process big emotions, fear, grief, and difficult life events. He never preached religion directly on his show, instead focusing on universal messages about love, acceptance, and being a good neighbor. Rogers also testified before Congress in 1969 to save public broadcasting funding. 49. The Mayflower Compact gets celebrated as the foundational document of American democracy and self-government, but the actual reason it existed was significantly less inspirational than textbooks pretend. The Mayflower originally was supposed to land in Virginia territory, where the Pilgrims had legal permission to settle under their official charter. Storms blew the ship dramatically off course, dumping them near Cape Cod with zero legal authority whatsoever. Several non-religious passengers called strangers immediately began threatening mutiny, arguing the contracts no longer applied. The 41 male Pilgrims hastily drafted the compact, basically to force everyone to obey appointed leadership and prevent the whole colony from descending into chaos before winter arrived. 50. The Civil War gets remembered in some modern circles as a noble dispute about states' rights, and not specifically about slavery. But Confederate states left clear written documentation contradicting that exact narrative. Every single seceding state issued formal declarations of causes explaining their reasoning, and these documents repeatedly cite slavery as the primary motivation. Mississippi opened its declaration by stating its position was thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and others said essentially identical things using equally blunt language. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens even gave his famous cornerstone speech declaring slavery as the foundation of the new government. The documents speak quite plainly. 51. The Trail of Tears is sometimes taught as a sad relocation journey, but the actual scale of suffering was closer to government-orchestrated mass death across the American Southeast. Following the 1830 Indian Removal Act, signed by President Andrew Jackson, roughly 16,000 Cherokee people were forcibly marched from their ancestral homelands in Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama to Oklahoma Territory between 1838 and 1839. Conditions were absolutely horrific, with soldiers herding families into stockades, providing barely any food, and forcing winter travel without proper shelter or clothing. Approximately 4,000 Cherokee died along the way from disease, starvation, exposure, and exhaustion. Other tribes like the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole suffered similar fates. 52. Henry Ford takes credit in virtually every American business textbook for inventing the moving assembly line. but Michigan auto manufacturer Ransom Olds actually patented the concept years earlier. Olds developed the stationary assembly line in 1901 for building his curved-dash Oldsmobile, dramatically increasing production from roughly 425 cars to 2,500 cars per year. Ford engineers later studied Olds' operation closely, then improved it by adding the famous moving conveyor belt in 1913 at the Highland Park plant. Ford's version was genuinely revolutionary because it cut Model T assembly time from 12 hours down to about 90 minutes. But the original innovation absolutely belongs to Ransom Olds, not Henry Ford. 53. The Pledge of Allegiance recited by American schoolchildren every morning originally came with an extremely uncomfortable hand gesture that looked nearly identical to the Nazi salute. Baptist minister Francis Bellamy wrote the pledge in 1892, and his accompanying Bellamy salute involved extending the right arm stiffly forward with palm down toward the flag. American kids performed this exact gesture for roughly 50 years in classrooms across the country. Then Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany using essentially the same salute for the Nazi Party. Congress quickly passed legislation in December 1942, officially replacing the Bellamy salute with the hand-over-heart gesture Americans still use today. 54. Operation Paperclip sounds like a quirky office supply program, but the actual mission involved the United States government secretly recruiting over 1,600 former Nazi scientists immediately after World War II. American intelligence agencies wanted German expertise in rocketry, aerospace, chemical weapons, and medicine before the Soviet Union could grab them first. Many recruits had been active Nazi Party members, with some implicated in war crimes, including using concentration camp prisoners as test subjects. Rocket engineer Werner von Braun, who designed Hitler's Vibe 2 missiles using slave labor at Mittelwerk, eventually led NASA's Saturn V rocket program. Records were systematically sanitized to hide war crime connections from public view. 55. Annie Oakley dazzled audiences across America as the sharpshooting star of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. But her most fascinating offer to the country involved an actual proposal to fight in World War I. In 1917, the 57-year-old Oakley wrote directly to the United States War Department, offering to personally recruit, train, and lead an entire regiment of female sharpshooters into combat against Germany. She emphasized that women shooters could match or exceed male soldiers in marksmanship abilities. The War Department politely declined her unprecedented offer, considering combat roles unthinkable for women at that time. Oakley also offered free shooting lessons to thousands of American soldiers before deployment, training reportedly over 15,000 troops. 56 cowboys riding the open range conjure thrilling images of shootouts, saloon brawls, and dramatic gunfights at sunset, but the actual daily reality involved staggering amounts of mind-numbing tedium and animal waste. Most cowboys spent their 12 to 16-hour workdays slowly driving cattle across endless prairies, eating dust, riding through brutal weather, and constantly worrying about losing stock. Other tasks included mending fences, branding calves, breaking wild horses, fixing equipment, and yes, shoveling enormous quantities of manure out of corrals and barns. Pay averaged roughly $30 per month, which was barely enough to survive. Real gunfights happened far less often than getting kicked by an angry mule. 57. The microwave oven sitting in every American kitchen exists because of one Raytheon engineer named Percy Spencer, noticing something extremely weird happening in his pants during 1945. Spencer was working with active radar equipment, using high-powered magnetron tubes, when he suddenly realized a chocolate peanut bar in his pocket had completely melted into a sticky mess. Most people would have just changed pants and moved on with their day. Spencer instead immediately grabbed popcorn kernels and an egg, holding both near the magnetron. The popcorn popped everywhere, and the egg exploded onto a colleague's face. Raytheon patented the first commercial microwave oven called the Radar Range in 1947. 58. The idea that American women always had basic financial independence is genuinely shocking to dismantle, considering women could not legally obtain credit cards in their own name until 1974. Before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed that year, banks routinely required women to have a husband, father, or sometimes even an adult son, co-sign for any credit card, loan, or mortgage application. Single women, divorced women, and widows faced enormous obstacles accessing basic financial services that men handled routinely. Banks could legally refuse credit based on gender, marital status, or refusal to use birth control. The law also covered banking, employment lending, and dramatically reshaped American women's economic lives. 59. The Navajo code talkers serving in the Pacific Theater during World War II created the only military code in modern history that enemy cryptographers never managed to crack. Roughly 400 young Navajo men joined the Marines starting in 1942, developing a complex code based on their indigenous language. They essentially created Navajo words for military terms that did not exist in their language, like calling submarines ironfish and dive bombers chickenhawks. Japanese intelligence officers spent years frantically trying to decode intercepted transmissions and never succeeded once. The program remained completely classified until 1968. Code talkers received congressional gold medals decades later, with some recipients finally honored in their late 90s. 60. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover conducted one of the most disturbing harassment campaigns in American government history against civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. throughout the 1960s. The agency wiretapped his phones, bugged hotel rooms, monitored his movements, and compiled extensive files on his personal life, specifically looking for damaging material. In November 1964, an FBI agent mailed King an anonymous package containing audio recordings of alleged extramarital affairs along with a typed letter. The letter explicitly suggested King had only one option available, encouraging him to take his own life before public exposure ruined everything. King survived this horrifying intimidation and continued his civil rights work until his 1968 assassination in Memphis. 61. Daniel Boone gets remembered in every American frontier illustration wearing his iconic coonskin cap, which is genuinely hilarious considering the real Daniel Boone absolutely despised that style of headwear. The famous Kentucky frontiersman actually wore a wide-brimmed felt hat throughout his entire adult life. Considering coonskin caps crude, smelly, and beneath his personal sense of dignity, Boone reportedly complained about them on multiple recorded occasions to friends and family members. The Coonskin Cap Association came largely from theatrical productions, dime novels, and later Hollywood productions, particularly the 1955 Disney television series starring Fess Parker. The Davy Crockett craze that exploded afterward retroactively pinned the same coonskin look onto poor Daniel Boone, too. 62. Robert E. Lee gets defended endlessly today by people insisting his statues honor a noble Southern general, but Lee himself publicly opposed building any Confederate monuments after the Civil War ended in 1865. Writing to multiple correspondents during his post-war years as president of Washington College in Virginia, Lee repeatedly argued that erecting memorials to Confederate battles or leaders would only keep open the sores of war and prevent national healing. He specifically refused to attend Gettysburg battlefield memorial events when invited. Lee believed Southerners should focus on rebuilding and reconciling, rather than glorifying the lost cause. He died in 1870, decades before most Confederate statues were even erected. 63. The United States Army Camel Corps sounds like a hilariously fake historical sketch, but it was a completely real military program established in 1855 by Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. The Army imported roughly 75 camels from the Middle East and North Africa, hoping these desert animals could revolutionize transportation across the harsh American Southwest territories. Camels could carry twice the load of mules, travel further between water sources, and handle desert heat brilliantly. The experiment actually worked reasonably well during early trials. Unfortunately, mules and horses absolutely hated camels and panicked around them. Drivers refused to work with the strange beasts, and the Civil War interrupted everything before the program could expand. 64. Eli Whitney also gets credit for inventing interchangeable parts, but French gunsmiths actually developed this manufacturing concept several decades before Whitney famously claimed it during his 1801 demonstration for President John Adams. French engineer Honoré Blanc was producing musket parts with interchangeable components as early as the 1770s, even disassembling 50 muskets in front of Thomas Jefferson and reassembling them using randomly mixed parts. Jefferson sent enthusiastic reports back to America describing the impressive system. Whitney later borrowed the concept, secured a government contract worth $134,000, and dramatically performed his own demonstration. His muskets actually were not perfectly interchangeable yet either, requiring significant hand-fitting that he conveniently hid from observers. 65. Chocolate chip cookies are basically America's official cookie, but their creation in 1938 was a complete accident at the Toll House Inn in Whitman, Massachusetts. Innkeeper Ruth Wakefield was baking butter drop cookies for guests when she ran out of regular baker's chocolate. She grabbed a semi-sweet Nestle chocolate bar instead, chopped it into small chunks, and tossed those pieces into her dough, expecting them to melt and create chocolate cookies. Instead, the chunks stubbornly held their shape, creating the first ever chocolate chip cookies. Guests went absolutely wild for them. Nestle later bought the recipe rights from Wakefield for $1, plus a lifetime supply of free chocolate. 66. English getting designated as America's official national language seems like an obvious founding choice, but the United States Constitution intentionally and permanently never declared any official language whatsoever. The founders specifically debated language during early congressional sessions and deliberately chose neutrality, partly because significant German, Dutch, French, and Spanish-speaking communities already populated various colonies. Pennsylvania alone had massive German-speaking populations who fought in the Revolutionary War. Designating English officially would have alienated huge segments of the new country immediately. Today, roughly 30 individual states have passed their own English official laws, but the federal government has stubbornly maintained linguistic neutrality for nearly 250 continuous years now. 67. War plan. Red sounds like a wild conspiracy theory invented for late-night podcasts, but the United States military genuinely developed detailed plans to invade Canada during the 1920s and 1930s. American war planners feared a potential conflict with the British Empire could erupt, and Canada represented the easiest British territory to attack directly. The plan called for invading through Vermont toward Montreal, capturing Halifax to block reinforcements, seizing Winnipeg, and occupying Vancouver. The military even built actual forts and airstrips along the Canadian border specifically for this scenario. Congress publicly authorized the plan in 1935. War Plan Red was finally officially declassified in 1974, much to Canadian historians' delight. 68. Annie Edson Taylor became the first person to successfully survive going over Niagara Falls in a barrel on October 24, 1901, which happened to be her 63rd birthday. The retired Michigan schoolteacher was completely broke and desperately seeking fame and money to fund her later years. She designed a custom oak barrel padded with cushions, climbed inside with her lucky heart-shaped pillow, and had assistants seal her in. The barrel plunged 167 feet over Horseshoe Falls. Rescuers cracked it open expecting a corpse, and instead found Taylor mostly intact with only a small head wound. She famously declared that no one should ever attempt the stunt again. 69. The melting pot concept describing American immigration sounds like something Benjamin Franklin or Alexander Hamilton would have proudly coined, but the actual phrase came from a 1908 stage play by British Jewish playwright Israel Zangwill. The play, titled The Melting Pot, premiered in Washington, D.C. with President Theodore Roosevelt enthusiastically attending opening night. The drama featured a Russian Jewish immigrant character celebrating America as a great crucible where all European races would melt together into a unified new people. The phrase exploded in popularity afterward, becoming a standard American immigration metaphor. The actual founders, of course, had wildly varying opinions on immigration that ranged from welcoming to deeply suspicious of outsiders. 70. John Adams successfully defending the British soldiers accused in the Boston Massacre is one of the most counterintuitive moments in American Revolutionary history. After the March 1770 incident, where British troops fired into a Boston crowd killing 5 colonists, the soldiers desperately needed legal representation. Future second President John Adams agreed to defend them in court despite his strong patriot sympathies. arguing that fair trials mattered more than political convenience. Adams successfully got 6 soldiers completely acquitted by proving they acted in self-defense against an angry mob throwing snowballs, rocks, and oysters. 2 soldiers received manslaughter convictions and were branded on the thumb. Adams later called this case his proudest legal moment. 71. President Ulysses S. Grant, getting arrested for speeding in 1872 while sitting as the actual sitting president of the United States, is one of the most genuinely hilarious moments in American executive branch history. Grant was racing his horse-drawn carriage through Washington, D.C. at dangerously high speeds when Officer William West, a black Civil War veteran, pulled him over near 13th and M Streets. West recognized the president immediately, but informed him that he still had to be detained. Grant graciously admitted his wrongdoing, paid a $20 bond at the police station, and walked back to the White House. He never actually appeared in court, but he praised the officer afterward. 72. The Donner Party getting trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains during winter 1846 to 1847 spawned America's most notorious cannibalism story, but the actual details are significantly less universal than legend suggests. Roughly 87 emigrants got snowbound near what became known as Donner Lake after taking a disastrous shortcut through Utah and Nevada. Only about half of the eventual survivors resorted to cannibalism to stay alive, and most consumed flesh from companions who had already died from starvation or exposure rather than killing anyone. 2 cases involving Native American guides being killed for food remain genuinely disturbing exceptions. Of 87 original travelers, only 48 ultimately survived the brutal mountain ordeal. 73. The Whig Party once won the presidency twice, dominated American politics for 2 solid decades, and then completely collapsed into nothing during the 1850s, which most modern Americans find genuinely shocking. The party formed in 1833 specifically opposing President Andrew Jackson's executive overreach and supporting industrial development, banking reform, and federal infrastructure projects. Whig presidents William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor both won elections, though Harrison died after only 31 days in office and Taylor died 16 months into his term. The party fractured completely over slavery during the 1850s, with Northern Whigs eventually joining the brand new Republican Party. By 1860, the Whigs had vanished entirely from American politics. 74. Levi Strauss takes full credit for inventing blue jeans, but the actual innovation came from a struggling Latvian Jewish immigrant tailor named Jacob Davis working in Reno, Nevada. Davis was making sturdy work pants for local miners and railroad workers when a customer's wife requested something extra durable in 1870. Davis cleverly added copper rivets at stress points like pocket corners and the fly base, dramatically extending pant lifespan. He could not afford the $68 patent application fee on his own, so he wrote to his fabric supplier Levi Strauss in San Francisco proposing a partnership. They jointly patented the riveted denim work pants on May 20, 1873. 75. Harriet Tubman gets celebrated primarily as an Underground Railroad conductor, but her most stunning achievement was actually leading an armed Civil War military raid that freed over 700 enslaved people in a single night. On June 2, 1863, Tubman guided 3 Union Army gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina, navigating tricky waters using intelligence from local scouts she personally recruited. The raid destroyed Confederate supply lines, burned plantations, and freed approximately 750 enslaved men, women, and children who waded out to board the boats. Tubman became the first woman in American military history to lead an armed assault. She received 0 military pension for 30 years afterwards. 76. The American dream sounds like a concept stretching back to the Pilgrims, the founders, or at least to 19th century immigration waves. But the actual phrase was coined in 1931 by historian James Truslow Adams. Adams introduced the term in his Depression-era book titled The Epic of America, describing a dream of a land in which life should be better, richer, and fuller for everyone with opportunities according to ability or achievement. He explicitly emphasized that this was not merely about material wealth or fancy cars. Adams meant a society where people could achieve their full potential regardless of birth circumstances. The phrase exploded into common American usage almost immediately afterward. 77. Sitting Vice President Aaron Burr killing former Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton in a duel on July 11, 1804, and then never facing any consequences is one of the wildest political events in American history. The two political enemies had feuded bitterly for years over various elections, finances, and personal insults that Hamilton repeatedly published. They met at dawn in Weehawken, New Jersey, with pistols. Hamilton apparently fired into the air, while Burr shot him directly in the abdomen. Hamilton died the next day in agony. Burr fled south but eventually returned, completed his vice presidential term, and was indicted in both New York and New Jersey before being acquitted everywhere. 78. William Randolph Hearst essentially manufactured the Spanish-American War in 1898 through his wildly sensational newspaper empire, particularly the New York Journal. Hearst engaged in fierce circulation battles with Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, both publishers running increasingly outrageous stories about Spanish atrocities in Cuba to sell more papers. When the USS Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor on February 15, 1898, killing 266 American sailors, Hearst immediately blamed Spain despite zero actual evidence. His papers screamed for war in massive headlines daily for weeks. Hearst supposedly told illustrator Frederick Remington, "You furnish the pictures and I will furnish the war." President McKinley caved to public pressure that April. 79. President Calvin Coolidge kept an absolutely wild assortment of pets in the White House during the 1920s, but his favorite was definitely a raccoon named Rebecca. A Mississippi supporter originally sent the raccoon to the White House for Thanksgiving dinner in 1926, intending for the Coolidge family to eat her. Calvin and his wife Grace immediately decided Rebecca was way too charming to consume, so they adopted her instead. Grace built a custom treehouse on the White House lawn, and the president personally walked Rebecca around the grounds on a leash made of green silk ribbon. Rebecca attended state functions, played in bathrooms, and bit several diplomats over the years. 80. The Newburgh Conspiracy of 1783 nearly ended the American Revolution in a military coup against the brand new Continental Congress, which most Americans have never even heard about. Continental Army officers stationed at Newburgh, New York, were furious about years of unpaid wages, missing pensions, and broken government promises. Anonymous letters circulated through camp suggesting that soldiers should march on Philadelphia and forcibly demand payment from Congress. George Washington learned about the brewing mutiny and personally addressed his officers on March 15, 1783. He famously fumbled for his reading glasses, telling the room he had grown gray and nearly blind serving his country. The officers wept openly and abandoned the conspiracy. 81. The Cherokee Nation, before forced removal, had developed a remarkably sophisticated society that genuinely embarrassed American officials desperately trying to justify stealing their land. By the 1820s, the Cherokee had adopted a written constitution modeled partly on the United States Constitution, established a bicameral legislature, built a Supreme Court system, and constructed schools across their territory. Sequoyah single-handedly invented an entire Cherokee syllabary in 1821, achieving near-universal literacy among his people within just a few years. The Cherokee Phoenix newspaper began publishing in both Cherokee and English in 1828. The Supreme Court even ruled in their favor in 1832, but President Andrew Jackson simply ignored the decision entirely. 82. The Hindenburg disaster of May 6, 1937 conjures terrifying images of total catastrophe, but most passengers and crew actually survived the famous explosion at Lakehurst, New Jersey. The massive German airship was attempting to dock when something ignited the hydrogen gas, engulfing the entire 800-foot Zeppelin in flames within roughly 35 seconds. Of the 97 people aboard, 36 died, including 13 passengers, 22 crew members, and 1 ground worker. That means 61 people somehow managed to survive jumping or falling from a burning hydrogen balloon. Many got out simply because the airship was already descending close to the ground when the fire started. The disaster effectively ended commercial passenger airship travel forever. 83. Velcro feels like one of those classic NASA inventions developed for spacewalks and astronaut suits. But the actual creator was a Swiss electrical engineer named Georges de Mestral, working long before the space program existed. In 1941, de Mestral returned from an alpine hunting trip with his dog, covered in stubborn burrs from burdock plants. Curious about why they stuck so persistently, he examined them under a microscope and discovered tiny hooks catching loops in fabric and fur. 8 years of experimentation followed before he successfully patented the hook and loop fastener in 1955. NASA later adopted Velcro for various missions, accidentally cementing the false invention myth into permanent American memory. 84. Prohibition lasted 13 full years across America from 1920 to 1933 and accidentally created the most powerful organized crime network the country had ever seen. The 18th Amendment banned manufacturing, selling, and transporting alcoholic beverages, but absolutely failed to ban consumption itself. Americans kept drinking enthusiastically, creating an enormous black market opportunity for bootleggers, smugglers, and gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago and Lucky Luciano in New York. Speakeasies multiplied to roughly 100,000 illegal bars in New York City alone. Capone reportedly earned $60 million annually from bootlegging operations. Federal agents could barely keep up. The 21st Amendment finally repealed prohibition in December 1933. 85. George Washington chopping down his father's cherry tree and confessing because he could not tell a lie is the single most quoted childhood story about any American president, except the entire tale was completely fabricated. Traveling biographer Mason Locke Weems invented the cherry tree story after Washington's 1799 death, specifically to sell more copies of his biography. The story did not appear at all in early editions of his book. Weems quietly added it to the 5th edition in 1806, claiming a mysterious, unnamed elderly neighbor had told him the anecdote decades earlier. The story exploded in popularity through schoolbook reprints, becoming permanent American mythology. No actual evidence ever existed. 86. The Comanche Empire dominated the southern Great Plains for over a century, becoming one of the most powerful military forces in North American history, which most American textbooks completely ignore. After mastering Spanish horses in the early 1700s, the Comanche transformed themselves into terrifying mounted warriors controlling territory across modern Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, and Colorado. They successfully halted Spanish northward expansion from Mexico for decades, defeated the Apache, dominated trade routes, and even forced the Mexican government to pay tribute. Comanche raiders pushed deep into Mexico, sometimes reaching nearly 1,000 miles south of Texas. The empire only collapsed after American military campaigns and disease finally broke their power. 87. Bubblegum exists today entirely because a 23-year-old accountant named Walter Deemer was messing around in a candy factory office during 1928 instead of doing his actual job. Deemer worked for the Fleer Chewing Gum Company in Philadelphia, where he had absolutely no formal chemistry training. He spent his lunch breaks experimenting with various gum recipes purely for fun, eventually stumbling onto a formula that produced large, stretchy bubbles. The only food coloring available in the factory that day happened to be pink, which is why bubblegum has remained pink ever since. He called his creation Double Bubble. Deemer personally taught salespeople how to blow bubbles before launch. 88. The Plymouth colony nearly starved itself to death during the early 1620s by attempting strict communal farming, before switching desperately to private plot ownership instead. Governor William Bradford initially required everyone to work shared fields and contribute to a common food storehouse, regardless of individual effort or family size. Productivity collapsed almost immediately because young single men resented working hard for other people's families. Women refused to do laundry for unrelated men, considering it a form of slavery. After 3 brutal winters of mass starvation, Bradford assigned individual plots to each family in 1623. Production exploded dramatically that very season, and the colony finally stabilized economically forever. 89. The American buffalo population crashed from roughly 30 million animals down to fewer than 500 individuals during the late 1800s, and the United States Army deliberately encouraged this catastrophic destruction as official military strategy. Army officials recognized that Plains tribes like the Sioux, Cheyenne, Comanche, and Arapaho depended entirely on buffalo for food, clothing, shelter, and religious life. Destroying the herds would essentially destroy native resistance without firing additional bullets. General Philip Sheridan reportedly told Texas legislators that buffalo hunters were doing more to defeat tribes than the entire army combined. Professional hunters slaughtered millions for hides alone, leaving carcasses rotting across the plains by the thousands. 90. The Post. Its note exists because a 3M chemist named Spencer Silver spent years trying to develop a super-strong adhesive in 1968 and accidentally invented an incredibly weak one instead. Silver could not figure out any commercial use for his sticky but easily removable glue, spending half a decade giving internal seminars at 3M begging colleagues for application ideas. Nobody bit. Then in 1974, fellow 3M scientist Art Fry got annoyed when his church choir bookmark kept falling out of his hymnal. Fry remembered Silver's weird weak adhesive and combined the two ideas. 3M finally launched Post-it notes nationally in 1980, becoming one of the most successful office products ever. 91. Sojourner. Truth delivering her legendary Ain't I a Woman speech at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio, is one of the most quoted moments in American activist history, except she almost certainly never actually said that exact phrase. Truth was a former enslaved woman born in New York who spoke Dutch as her first language, and English with a clear northeastern accent, not a southern drawl. Journalist Marius Robinson wrote down the actual speech right after she delivered it, and his version contains no "ain't I a woman" refrain whatsoever. Abolitionist Frances Dana Barker Gage published the now famous version 12 years later in 1863, adding the dramatic southern dialect and repeating refrain herself. 92. The Hatfield-McCoy feud sounds like an exaggerated mountain legend about two cartoonish backwoods families, but the actual conflict killed over a dozen people and reached the United States Supreme Court. The bloody feud between the Hatfield clan of West Virginia and the McCoy clan of Kentucky raged across the Tug Fork River Valley from roughly 1863 through 1891. Triggers included a disputed pig ownership, a forbidden Romeo and Juliet-style romance between Rosanna McCoy and John Hatfield, and a Civil War-era murder. At least 13 family members died in various ambushes, raids, and execution-style killings. The Supreme Court eventually ruled on extradition rights in the case Mon versus Justice in 1888. 93. Geronimo became one of the most feared and famous Apache warriors in American frontier history, but his actual Apache name was Goyaway, meaning the one who yawns. The name Geronimo was actually shouted by panicked Mexican soldiers during battles in the 1850s, possibly calling out to Saint Jerome for protection while Goyaway attacked their positions. The nickname stuck so persistently that even his own people eventually adopted it. Goyaway led brilliant guerrilla resistance against Mexican and American forces across Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico for nearly 30 years. American paratroopers later began shouting Geronimo while jumping from planes during World War II, which would have absolutely baffled the actual man. 94. The United States capital city sitting permanently in Washington, D.C. feels like an obvious historical given, but the federal government actually moved through 9 different cities before finally settling along the Potomac River in 1800. Philadelphia hosted the Continental Congress during much of the Revolution. The capital also temporarily sat in Baltimore, Lancaster, York, Princeton, Annapolis, Trenton, New York City, and back to Philadelphia again. The Residence Act of 1790 finally established Washington, D.C. as a permanent capital, partly as a compromise between northern and southern states. President John Adams became the first executive to actually live in the unfinished White House when he moved in during November 1800. 95. Susan B. Anthony got arrested for voting illegally in the 1872 presidential election and then spent the rest of her life publicly refusing to pay her $100 fine, which is genuinely iconic protest behavior. Anthony marched into a Rochester, New York polling place that November, along with 15 other women, successfully convinced election officials to register them, and cast ballots for President Ulysses Grant. Federal authorities arrested her 2 weeks later. At her 1873 trial, The judge actually wrote his guilty verdict before testimony even began. Anthony defiantly told the court she would never pay the fine, and authorities chose not to imprison her over it. The fine remained unpaid forever. 96. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated military unit of its size in American history during World War II, which is genuinely staggering considering most of these Japanese-American soldiers had families locked behind barbed wire back home. The regiment formed in 1943, drawing primarily from Hawaiian Nisei volunteers plus young men recruited directly from internment camps across the western United States. They fought ferociously through brutal European campaigns in Italy, France, and Germany. The 442nd earned over 18,000 individual decorations, including 21 Medals of Honor. Meanwhile, around 120,000 Japanese Americans remained imprisoned without trial, having lost homes, businesses, and possessions through Executive Order 9066. 97. Theodore Roosevelt getting shot in the chest during a 1912 presidential campaign speech, and then delivering 90 minutes of remarks anyway, is genuinely one of the most absurdly tough moments in American political history. A saloon keeper named John Schrank shot Roosevelt at point-blank range outside a Milwaukee hotel as he prepared to address supporters. The bullet passed through his folded 50-page speech and metal eyeglass case before lodging in his chest muscle. Roosevelt coughed into his hand, saw no blood, and concluded the wound had missed his lungs. He proceeded to the auditorium and spoke for 90 full minutes, opening by telling the crowd he had just been shot. Doctors left the bullet inside. 98. The first American Revolutionary flag flown by George Washington's Continental Army in January 1776 still had the British Union Jack proudly displayed in the upper corner, which seems wildly counterintuitive today. The Grand Union flag featured 13 alternating red and white stripes representing the colonies, but the Canton corner showed the combined English and Scottish crosses of Britain. Washington personally raised this flag at his Cambridge, Massachusetts headquarters while besieging Boston. The design reflected the colonists' complicated early position, which was officially demanding British rights rather than full independence at that exact moment. Congress only adopted the familiar stars and stripes design in June 1777, completely removing British symbolism forever. 99. Albert Einstein was formally offered the presidency of Israel in November 1952, following the death of Chaim Weizmann, the country's first president. The Israeli ambassador to the United States, Abba Eban, personally delivered the offer to Einstein at his Princeton, New Jersey home through official diplomatic channels. The brilliant physicist, then 73 years old and arguably the most famous scientist alive, politely but firmly declined the position. Einstein wrote that he was deeply moved by the honor, but felt completely unsuited for political office, lacking both the natural aptitude and necessary experience to deal properly with human beings. He spent his remaining years in Princeton until his death in 1955. 100. The Hawaiian Kingdom existed as a fully recognized sovereign nation with treaties, embassies, and royal courts until American businessmen backed by United States Marines overthrew Queen Liliuokalani in January 1893. A group of mostly American sugar planters calling themselves the Committee of Safety wanted to annex Hawaii to the United States for economic reasons, including avoiding tariffs. They coordinated with U.S. Minister John Stevens, who ordered 162 American Marines from the USS Boston to land in Honolulu, surrounding the royal palace. Queen Liliuokalani surrendered under protest to prevent bloodshed. President Grover Cleveland later condemned the coup as completely illegal, but Congress eventually annexed Hawaii anyway in 1898. 101. Henry Ford, accepting a Nazi medal in 1938 from Adolf Hitler's regime, is one of the most uncomfortable chapters in American industrial history, but the event absolutely happened. German diplomats personally awarded Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle at a lavish birthday celebration in Dearborn, Michigan, that July. This was the highest honor Nazi Germany gave to any foreign civilian. Ford had spent years publishing anti-Semitic material through his Dearborn Independent newspaper, including the notorious series called The International Jew. Hitler reportedly kept a large photograph of Ford on his Munich office wall and praised him in Mein Kampf. Ford never returned the medal, despite mounting public criticism leading up to World War II. 102. The Great Chicago Fire of October, 1871 destroyed roughly 4 square miles of the city, killed approximately 300 people, and left around 100,000 residents homeless. But Mrs. O'Leary's cow definitely did not start it. Chicago Republican newspaper reporter Michael Ahern publicly admitted decades later that he invented the entire kicked lantern cow story specifically to make his article more entertaining for readers. The fire did genuinely begin in or near the O'Leary family barn on DeKoven Street, but no actual evidence ever connected the cow to anything. Catherine O'Leary spent the rest of her life as a recluse, completely traumatized by the false accusation. Chicago officially exonerated her family in 1997, 126 years later. 103. The Articles of Confederation served as America's first official constitution and lasted only 8 rocky years before being completely abandoned for the current document. Ratified in 1781 after years of wartime drafting, the Articles created an extremely weak central government with no power to tax, no executive branch, no national court system, and no ability to regulate commerce between states. Each state essentially operated like an independent country, printing its own money, ignoring federal requests, and quarreling endlessly with neighbors over trade. Shays' Rebellion in 1786 finally convinced founders that something stronger was desperately needed. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in 1787, replacing the failed Articles with the current Constitution by 1789. 104. Lewis and Clark get all the famous expedition glory, but their actual primary guide across the Louisiana Territory was a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau, hired specifically before Sacagawea ever joined the journey. The Corps of Discovery met Charbonneau at Fort Mandan, in present-day North Dakota during winter 1804. He spoke multiple Native American languages plus French, which proved essential for trade negotiations across the West. Charbonneau brought along his teenage Shoshone wife Sacagawea, who joined the trip purely as part of his package deal. Sacagawea proved far more useful and skilled than her husband, but Charbonneau was technically the hired employee, earning roughly $500 total. 105. The 19th Amendment, ratified in August 1920, granted American women the constitutional right to vote, but most black women living in southern states could not actually exercise that right until the Voting Rights Act passed 45 years later in 1965. Jim Crow laws across former Confederate states deployed poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence to prevent black citizens from voting regardless of gender. Black women showing up to register faced harassment, job loss, physical attacks, and impossible bureaucratic obstacles. Activists like Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, and Ella Baker spent decades organizing voter registration drives across Mississippi and Alabama. The Voting Rights Act finally banned discriminatory voting practices nationwide. 106. Texas existed as a fully independent sovereign country called the Republic of Texas for nearly 10 complete years before joining the United States, which most non-Texan Americans tend to forget completely. After winning independence from Mexico in 1836 following the Texas Revolution, the Republic operated with its own president, Congress, military, currency, postal service, and foreign embassies. Sam Houston served as the first president of this brand new nation. Texas successfully established diplomatic relations with the United States, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and several other countries. The Republic struggled financially throughout its existence, drowning in debt and constantly worried about Mexican invasion. Texas finally accepted American annexation in December 1845. 107. The United States purchased Alaska from Imperial Russia in 1867 for approximately $7.2 million, which works out to about 2 cents per acre across the enormous territory. Secretary of State William Seward personally negotiated the deal, signing the treaty around 4 a.m. on March 30, 1867 in Washington, D.C. American newspapers immediately mocked the entire purchase, calling Alaska Seward's Icebox, Seward's Folly, and the Polar Bear Garden. Critics could not believe anyone would pay millions of dollars for what appeared to be a frozen wasteland. Then prospectors discovered massive gold deposits in the 1890s, followed by enormous oil reserves in the 1960s. Alaska eventually became one of the most valuable land deals in human history. 108. The Smithsonian Institution stands as America's premier collection of museums, research centers, and national treasures along the National Mall, but the founder was actually an Englishman who never set foot in the United States. British chemist and mineralogist James Smithson bequeathed his entire fortune of roughly $500,000 to the American government in his 1826 will. His instructions specified founding an establishment for the increase and diffusion of knowledge among men. Smithson had never visited America, had no family connections to the country, and held no particular reason to favor it over Britain. Congress argued for over a decade about whether to accept the gift before finally founding the Smithsonian in 1846. 109. The Roanoke Colony, established in 1587 along the coast of present-day North Carolina, became American history's most haunting mystery, with all 115 settlers completely vanishing without explanation. Governor John White sailed back to England for supplies in late 1587, leaving behind his daughter, granddaughter Virginia Dare, and fellow colonists. War with Spain delayed his return for 3 full years. When White finally arrived back in August 1590, the entire settlement stood empty with no bodies, no graves, and no signs of struggle anywhere. The only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post and CRO scratched into a tree. Historians still debate whether colonists merged with local Croatan tribes or perished. 110. The Pentagon, serving as the headquarters for the entire United States Department of Defense, feels like a building that took decades of careful planning, but construction actually finished in just 16 months during World War II. Ground broke on September 11, 1941, exactly 60 years before the September 11th attacks would damage the same building. Roughly 13,000 workers labored around the clock in 3 shifts, racing to complete the massive 5-sided structure as quickly as humanly possible. The finished Pentagon contained 17.5 miles of corridors, 7,754 windows, and approximately 6.5 million square feet of office space across 5 floors. Workers finished the entire project on January 15, 1943, an absolutely unbelievable construction timeline. 111. President Woodrow Wilson personally screened the racist film, The Birth of a Nation, inside the White House on February 18, 1915, which helped massively revive the Ku Klux Klan across America. Director D.W. Griffith's 3-hour silent epic portrayed Reconstruction-era Black Americans as dangerous brutes and depicted hooded Klan riders as heroic protectors of Southern civilization. Wilson reportedly told viewers afterward that the film was like writing history with lightning. The White House screening gave the movie enormous prestige nationwide. Membership in the Klan exploded from essentially zero into the millions over the following decade. The organization openly recruited members in northern cities like Indianapolis and Portland throughout the 1920s. And that wraps up 111 lies your history teacher swore on a stack of textbooks were absolutely true. From Paul Revere, whisper shouting about regulars, to Woodrow Wilson hosting Klan movie night inside the White House, American history turns out way weirder, way dumber, and way more ridiculous than anything your 7th grade classroom ever admitted. If your brain feels slightly broken right now, that means it worked. Smash that like button before you forget. Drop a comment telling us which lie shocked you the most, and subscribe to Dumb History for more chaos every week. Hit that notification bell too, because honestly, the dumbest stuff is still coming.